I had that very strong conviction that that was the right path to follow.
So what you're doing is you're overriding your nervous system. You're building up strength to your nervous system.
And I think even if at the moment you are not, you can decide to be what you are.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Theseus Body and Mind broadcast, live discussion. This week I'm interviewing my brother Gareth, who's usually our co-host anyway. But yeah, topic that I've wanted to speak with you about for a while, Gaz, on the show, which is going to be lessons that you learned from your time as a warden of a conservancy in Kenya. So lessons on health and human performance from the African bush. We're going to cover all sorts of stuff from the training that you were doing when you were there to the takeaways that you got from befriending the local tribes people there that you still have a very solid relationship with now. So loads of super interesting stuff to cover. Guys, just a quick reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit the like, subscribe, follow button, whichever it is, on whichever platform, to make sure you don't miss out on any of these discussions as they come out live or as they are replayed in the future. So without further ado, how are we doing, Gaz? All okay?
Well, I'm fine. It's a nice rainy day here in New Jersey.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, it's pretty rainy here in Berlin as well. So I know exactly how that feels. So yeah, this is a really super interesting talk. Like I said, I've wanted to cover something along these lines with you for ages because it's a bit of a abstract experience that you've had in comparison to most people in the developed world, having spent so much time out in Kenya doing what you did. So why don't we just start off with you giving a bit of an outline as to what you're doing out there, how long you were there, what your sort of primary role was when you were working there.
So on aggregate, about 7 years, and then my roles, I bounced around doing a few things. So number one, we ran fitness vacations based on a human evolutionary model, and we talk more about that in detail in a minute. I was also a wildlife warden of a 65,000 acre conservancy, which basically consisted of a skeleton crew of 2 to 3 men, and sometimes just me. And I also harvested bamboo up in the Aberdare forest, which is in the Central Highlands.
All right, awesome. So quite a diverse mix of things there.
Yeah.
We've got some specifically fitness orientated stuff, and then not at all really, going right to land management and sustainable agriculture down that kind of route. So that's a really interesting mix, which is one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you about this today. So let's start with the time that you spent with the fitness retreats then, because presumably there's a big evolution between the type of fitness and training that you were using to keep yourself in condition while you were there and that which you were participating in when you moved on from there. So give us a little bit more detail about that. You mentioned the evolutionary fitness model, which is something I find really interesting as well. So let's talk about what that is and what kind of training you were really doing when you were involved in that part.
So evolutionary fitness, as we ran it, and I still do, at the end of the pandemic, we'll be continuing to run courses like this. The whole philosophy behind it is, number one, we tend to forget that we are animals. We tend to, in the back of our minds, in our subconscious, think of humanity in the natural world, and it's almost like we were sort of superimposed on it, whereas actually we came up and out of evolution along with all these other animals. We tend to think of the world as an ancient place that predates human beings, and then human beings are this new thing, where actually our lineage, as we slowly evolve to be what we are today, is just as old. So that's the number one thing. Now, when you take that, for example, it's very easy when you look at, say, an animal in captivity, you can tell that essentially it's either not happy, not free, not healthy in the way that a wild animal would be, or at least I think these days most people do. I think, there might be the odd person that go, oh, what's to worry about? They don't get hunted, they don't get predated upon, they don't have to search for stuff, and if they get ill, they've got vets, and so on and so forth. But I think most of us nowadays, thanks to to David Attenborough and stuff like that, have grown up understanding that as a creature you fit an evolutionary and ecological niche. So that's a sort of fancy way of saying everybody's got their place in the natural world. And when you're out of that place, you're probably going to be less healthy, because everything about that creature, including a human being, has adapted to that kind of life. So if you were to look at the evolutionary history of human beings just over the last 30 million years, so for 24 million years, we were various morphs of ape-like primate. I say ape-like because the true line of apes hadn't spurred off yet. But ape-like, what does that mean? It means something that lived a life similar to modern-day apes live now. And so they're essentially arboreal, living in trees, fruitarian / insectivorous, and that is where we spent the bulk of our evolution. That's what we were for 24 of the last 30 million years. Then comes another really complex period of 6 million years where we start to become hominids. And what happens during that hominid phase is we become upright, as in bipedal. We, towards the end of that phase, and again, it's a really complex phase, and that's why it's sort of hard, or has been difficult, to find that missing link, because you get offshoots and branches and branches and branches, and you find fossils and things, and they appear to have some modern traits, but not others that we once thought that was a trait that predated this. And it's because they're an offshoot, so they're a cousin. But what was happening during that period is things would become subspecies or new species, but they were still close enough that you could still interbreed. And then, the geography and the patterns of the earth would bring them together, and, you'd get us again. Probably one of the most recent examples is we now know that Neanderthal, modern humans, and Denisovians have mixed at some stage. So we're descendants of all of those. That's all our lineage. That's the creature that we are. So without digressing too much, 24 million years as an ape-like primate, around 6 million years as a hominid, where some really important changes happen. We lose our hair, we get a bit fatter, we develop an ability to run endurance, and we start introducing more animal products into the diet, though that is controversial because it just simply depended on the fare. So the easiest way of saying we became massively adaptable to different areas, different climates, really radiated out. And then for the last 200,000 years, we were in our modern morph. And that first appeared in East Africa, around Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. That is why it's called the cradle of mankind, that area. And that environment has shaped us, shaped the species that we are. By taking people on fitness, holidays, vacations, whatever word you want to use, in that area, what you're doing is you're putting people back in that original environment to which most of the things that make us human adapted and evolved. So we became the modern human in that area, radiated out around the world because we are massively adaptable. But the bulk of the creature we are is, I'm trying to avoid using the word designed because I don't think anyone designed it, it evolved. But, with that caveat, because, my language skills are limited, but we're designed for that environment, and we're designed for a life in nature by the process of evolution.
Evolutionarily designed.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So the big philosophy of what evolutionary fitness is not to deny the brilliant things that modern culture has brought us, but is to recognize the creature that we truly, truly are, and treat the whole person through that lens. And that can be by way of species appropriate movement, species appropriate diet, species appropriate lifestyle and rhythms. So lifestyle and rhythms can be, your hours of sleep, perhaps when you eat, your stress management and those kinds of things, because all these responses, like when you sleep, the type of stress that you're, dare I say the word designed again, but I think everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say that you're designed to handle, comes from that life in nature, and very specifically in that environment. It was only 200,000 years ago, and 200,000 years is not enough time for a species to, or at least our species, to become another creature. So we are to give an analogy to sort of help people out what a short space of time it is. If you were to take any modern human and put them in a time machine and swap them with an East African baby, from two babies, from one from modern times and one from 200,000 years ago, and swap them around.
Time switch.
We'd be equally adaptable. There would be no issue. We would be, I mean, if they were European, they'd probably think you're a bit pale, because that's one of the minor sort of changes and adaptations. But essentially, as a creature, you're totally adapted to that environment, and you would thrive. You would equally thrive in both environments. Now, I say that equally thrive because something that I think is probably not news to a lot of people out there, and many listeners, is nowadays where we're coming at with this evolutionary fitness model is our issue isn't so much contractable diseases, which is an odd thing to say in the middle of a pandemic caused by a microbe, but or a virus. But most of the things that people die from nowadays are non-contractable diseases, and these are lifestyle diseases. So our lifestyles, even though we may be getting past breeding age, in older age are causing us to get sick. And it can be physical things like chronic injury, knees that knacker out, and, lower back issues and things like that even modern hunter-gatherers show they don't get, to, cavities in the teeth, crowded mouths, diabetes as a result of non-species specific diets and lifestyles, various types of cancer through lack of movement, exposure to toxins that were never in our normal environment, and also again back to diet, etc., and things like that. And truly, without attributing it to any one single factor and saying it's just the sugar or just that, it's all these things combined. And that is the power of East Africa for me, because we can talk about these things like we're talking now. We can read about what it's like in a book, but when you actually go there and experience it, and of course it's there for further research and study, that the natural East African environment is so important for understanding a human being. It's so important. And in many ways, if you want to get a bit more philosophical / spiritual about it, it's the link to the human soul. It's a link to the human spirit. That environment is how you understand the human spirit and the human condition. So I think, to digress a little, it's a very important environment to preserve and conserve as well. It's very important to understanding human wellness. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love what you said there. I've already forgotten exactly how you phrased it, but sort of being that environment, being able to sort of connect you back with your human spirit.
Exactly.
That's quite obvious to anyone who's spent any time there. If you speak to almost anyone who's been out to that part of the world, I mean, me, I've only been to Kenya, but speaking to other people that have only been to Kenya as well, there is something about Africa. There's something about that place you can't quite put your finger on that sort of reignites that little something inside you that makes you, whether you call it the human spirit, the soul, whatever you want to call it, there's something about it has a connection with that place. It's very strange.
Yeah, I think I was watching Ray Mears once, and he summed it up, and I've heard, he sort of spoke my thoughts, and I've heard other people say this as well. There's something about going to Africa, to the continent, to sub-Saharan Africa, especially for me, East Africa, that always feels like coming home, even if you've never been there before. There's such a deep history. There's this pulsing throb. It almost comes through the ground. You know, when you walk on it, you feel like boom, 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 boom,
Yeah.
boom, boom. There's this throbbing heartbeat and life to it.
Yeah, it's an amazing place, and I want to talk a little bit more specifically about that kind of aspect as well, with relation to health of the people that are living there in comparison to the developed world and all of that stuff. But firstly, while we're kind of on this train, you've talked about sort of the theory behind why a model of fitness training would be specific to the way in which a species has evolved. But what does that end up looking like? What sort of stuff do you do that would be different from, you know, more traditional ways of training practices that people do in the modern world now?
There are things that are becoming more popular in the health and fitness industry. One of them is sort of moving away from, let's analyze the origins of health and fitness culture. So back in basically before the 70s, yeah, people had weights and things like that, but most fitness behavior was based around sports. So most people's training, like if you did fitness, you basically you did a sport, and then I guess your training would normally be around getting better at that sport. So whether you know, people played tennis to keep fit, or you know, so badminton, so on and so forth, whatever it was, you know, people would normally play a sport recreationally, and that was their fitness. And then if you were competitive, you might run a bit more or something like that to improve your game. During what we think the model for the modern health and fitness industry really came about when Arnold Schwarzenegger made Pumping Iron, and bodybuilding became this thing, and people wanted a bit of that, you know, especially young men, and thus the health and fitness industry that we have now, as we recognize it now, was born, and it was all based around bodybuilding. It was just like sets and reps and pumping iron, and then it was, you know, toning, which is, you know, just a nonsense term, to be honest with you. It's tonus is a result of strength training, but you know, strength training and lifting weights, you know, sounded a bit unappealing to certain factions of society. So you know, it became toning and things like that, but it's still based around sets and reps and you know, isolating muscles and, you know, okay, some compound movements and things like that. But it became quite narrow in its focus, and it became very much focused less on performance and more on aesthetic, which is fine. But it moved away, I would say, from just raw health. Now health is a byproduct of any exercise, but it moved away from performance and human wellness. And to be honest with you, even sport sometimes constricts us to certain movements that aren't necessarily naturally human, or at least not to do them so much and so intensely as sport dictates for us. Many sports, when you think about it, often involve sort of straight lines, you know, running, you know, whether you're sprinting or running long distance, you know, it's still a straight line cyclic movement. Whether you're, you know, doing tennis, you know, the Rafa Nadal one big forearm and the skinny forearm, you know, and things like that. So it doesn't mimic a life in nature, which in its entirety, which the human body is expecting. And why do I keep saying the human body is expecting it? Well, there's lots of different, as you get deeper and deeper into this, there's lots of different functionalities that come from appropriate human movement that aren't even, you wouldn't really base around what your idea of is fitness, because fitness is about being strong, quick, and enduring. And for example, most people can probably relate to this. If you've been for a good walk, or maybe you go for a run, and about halfway through or at the end of it, you feel the need to go to the toilet. You know, you want to sit down and pinch one off. And part of that is evolution is this great time-saving and energy-saving process. It means the less energy I expend unnecessarily, then the more chance I've got living to tomorrow, next week, and reproducing and blah, blah, blah. So if you walk and run and move around, there's a process called peristalsis, which is moving food along the alimentary canal, the digestive canal, and eventually you excrete it. Now, if movement massages that food along, I don't need to waste energy with really powerful contractions throughout the day doing that. So in many ways, we've lost a little bit of efficiency on that, or never really needed to develop it because you're moving around anyway. So that's a benefit of species-appropriate movement daily that you would never think of as a result of fitness. Or the other one is, let's say, deep vein thrombosis. So people think of deep vein thrombosis, they think that's the thing people get when they're up in planes. And it's nothing to do with the altitude or the weirdness of being in that environment. It's actually just to do with sitting still for that amount of time. Because the human heart is not or no longer powerful enough to pump blood all the way to your extremities and all the way back again in a particularly efficient manner. And why does it need to be? Because you move around and it's got a very clever system that movement helps massage the blood through your systems and back. So in that sense, we are expecting a certain amount of movement, and it's species appropriate movement. We're expecting to stand up, put things overhead. We're expecting to put one foot in front of the other and move in all kinds of different directions throughout the day. And when you put that in the context of, okay, what would a person 200,000 years ago be doing? And what's great that we often forget is we try and say, like, people would be doing this and people would be doing that. And actually there's a lot, well, not a lot, but there's a few remaining examples left of people that do live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And we can actually observe them and say, what are people doing? And you'll find that they, in general, they do something along the lines of walk, run, swim, climb, reach overhead, bend down, go on all fours, walk on all fours, all these other kinds of things. Possibly swim, dance, that's a big one when they're socializing. And so these tend to happen on more or less a daily or if not a weekly basis. So we've got a really good example, living example, that we can quite logically say, okay, that is what the human body is adapted to do and is what it is expecting of us to, for one, maintain its health, and two, to be able to perform certain biological functions. It needs that type of stimuli to perform basic functions and maintain us and keep us healthy. And that, I think, is the major difference between the common perception that we have from the health and fitness industry and what an evolutionary fitness model is.
Okay, awesome. So in terms of a program that you would end up giving to somebody that was going to come out there with you and go through this, apply this evolutionary fitness model, what does that kind of end up looking like? Obviously, you've touched on it there with regards to reaching overhead, swimming, running, walking. But sort of how would it play out over several days or so?
So fundamentally, what we would do, or what we still do, I keep talking about it in the past tense, my wife tells me off for that, is we'd base the program on 12 to 13 human movement patterns. And these are based on, they're changed slightly, but they're based on a guy called Georges Herbert. And Georges Herbert was, from the turn of the century, he was a Frenchman traveling around the world, ended up in Africa, and he's got this great quote from being inspired by the people he saw. He said their bodies were splendid, nimble, flexible, and enduring, strong and enduring. Yet the only tutor they had in gymnastics were their lives in nature. And he was so inspired, he started a movement called Method Naturelle. And he's the guy that invented the first military assault course. So, when you're climbing over the ropes and jumping over things, he invented that for the French. So that was his idea of fitness back then, to try and promote this amongst sort of post-industrial revolution living people. And so what do we put in the courses? Well, we base it on an extrapolation of what he thought were the sort of default human movement patterns. And that is walking on all fours, walking, running, jumping, climbing, swimming, fighting. I'm missing one because he had 7. Sorry. Dance is an extra one. Oh crap. What am I talking about? All right. Walking on all fours, walking, running, jumping, climbing, throwing, and catching. So receiving, fighting, and I think that's all of it.
The others.
So,
that was the one you missed.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about throwing and catching is one thing I'm quite keen on, because it focuses on movements rather than muscles, and there's more to throwing and catching than just the obvious throwing an object ballistically and catching it. So how does that look? Well, modern athletes, we can take things from. So I'm not poo-pooing, modern sports, because at the apex of certain sports that just focus on one thing, you can see how the adapted human body does things perfectly. And an example of this is an Olympic weightlifter. An Olympic weightlifter is probably one of the best throwers and catchers out there. So you think of throwing and catching as a movement where, I'm sending something through the air. Well, an Olympic weightlifter can send a barbell up through the air ballistically, drop his body underneath it, because he probably doesn't have the strength to literal absolute force to lift that barbell, maybe not even as high as his belly button. And then he drops underneath it and catches it and stands up with it. And then he throws it ballistically over his head and then absorbs all that weight. So it's a very fluid and forgiving movement is catching. And it's something, I think that, Olympic weightlifter is a fantastic example of human coordination and speed in action. And so not that we teach exactly that stuff with a barbell, but I'm a big fan of at first using the kettlebells before moving on to odd-shaped objects like rocks and logs and sandbags that represent things that you would find in nature, unbalanced things that you'd find in nature, because we need to start somewhere. So it's easier to start with things with smooth grips that aren't going to rip up your hands, etc., etc. So the kettlebells, the way people generally train with kettlebells is less linear and isolating than we tend to with dumbbells and barbells. It's not so much about tricep extensions and bicep curls and leg extensions, etc., etc. It's more of a general exercise. Now, this is where our sports science comes in, and to lift this from something Pavel Tsatsouline said is, and I'm going to, if anybody's seen this interview with him, they'll know what I'm talking about. But in sports science, we break things down into exercises down into 2 categories. There's general exercise and there's specific exercise. And the example he gave, and I think it's just a really good one to repeat, is you can have a barbell back squat versus a leg extension. Now, a barbell back squat is what we call a general exercise. When you perform a barbell back squat, you will, as you progress on your back squat, have a translation of gains, which means you will run faster and jump higher. It will happen. That's what happens when you do a barbell back squat. When you exercise your legs by doing leg extensions, you get better at extending your leg. So it's a specific exercise as opposed to a general exercise. Most things that human beings naturally do have a general adaptation and will help you in other things. So using those, go back to those kettlebells, I'm a big fan of starting people off with the kettlebells just to make it easier, just to tune them into human natural movement. Because what often happens when people work out in, dare I say it, the more conventional health and fitness model is they tend to isolate muscles and in many ways sort of lose their natural athleticism. They're now detraining. It's called cheating in bodybuilding. You know, they're when you sort of put momentum into it and swing with a bicep curl, it's called a cheat curl. You know, if you dip and do a power press and push up, like it's called a power press in weightlifting, but it's called cheating in bodybuilding. So most gym protocols are based around making movements as inefficient as possible so that muscles respond well, as in they grow. Whereas in human natural movement, efficiency is everything you're looking for, because you're looking to develop fluidity of movement, coordination, efficiency. And that's one of the things we teach. So that's where I tend to start. I tend to start with that strength base first. And then throughout the rest of the course, using the natural environment, you will either in an isolated fashion or in a combined fashion, crawl on all fours, run, walk, jump, climb, swim, do some various things that represent combat, as in basically we basically take them outside and we teach them basic boxing, some basic grappling techniques that sort of can also be used in terms of self-defense, but it's just to stimulate that body and that mind in a human appropriate way. And then by the end of it, we're doing circuits that are outdoors and may involve like having a be on all fours, climbing up a sand dune, running along the top, coming down, picking up a stone, throwing it, running off, picking up, retrieving it, putting it to another spot, diving in the water, swimming around a buoy, and coming back. And these are the kind of circuits that we do that they're a bit more perhaps intense than would happen every day in a hunter-gatherer's lifestyle, but they are still human appropriate movements, and they're about change and adaptation, which only happens through intensity anyway. And we also throw in endurance activities. So there's a lot of running, there's a lot of teaching of barefoot running technique. There is long walks, and all out in nature, being inspired by the environment of wherever the retreat is taking place.
Awesome. Sounds amazing.
Yeah, it really is. Like I know we're doing it, so I would say that, but it really is. It really is. It really changes people's lives. And one of the major benefits is when people come away is the effects are very long lasting. I've done these all over the world in nature, but for me, the spiritual home of it is always East Africa. And one of the reasons why that I can pinpoint, because there's probably many that I don't even understand because of the fact that humans evolved there first. But I think day length is a really, really huge one. It's very easy to get up early and go to bed early in Kenya. Human beings are an equatorial species. You basically get 12 hours a day, 12 hours of night there. Day length only varies throughout the year by about 15 minutes. And you just fall into a really nice sleep pattern very easily. And because of that sleep pattern, much of our hormonal functionality is based around this. So it tends to sort out your appetite. You get hungry at appropriate times. You feel awake and alert at appropriate times, and sleepy and soporific at appropriate times. So you go through that whole rest and digest process very, very easily, I think, compared to other places, especially when you're away and the amount of electric light that's on is controlled and things like that. You tend to get up with the sun and go down with the sun. And I think that's actually where a lot of it starts. I think that's where a lot of the healing for people that come starts. And I say healing because I feel that most of the clients are sort of burnt out or in a stage of transition when they just, not really by design on our part, but just by the nature of things, when they choose to come away on a fitness vacation or on a course like this. And some people are just like super, super fit. They're looking to improve it or do something a bit different. But I'd say the vast majority of people are are in some sort of state of lifestyle transition anyway, and it's normally because they're burnt out because of the evolutionary mismatch effects of the industrial world, life in the industrial world.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's no secret, is it, that environment plays a huge role in impacting people's health and well-being. I mean, even if you just look at, for example, a list of the top 100 rehabilitation centers, like drug abuse rehabilitation centers, as an example. They're all in some of the most fantastic places in the world, like in terms of scenery. Beaches in South America, or the mountains in Switzerland, or whatever it might be. So, I mean, that in itself is testament that taking people out of wherever they are now and putting them in that environment that connects them with nature, that connects them with open space, and all of those things that would be very prevalent in somewhere like Kenya, obviously has an impact. And you touched on one there being the daylight. I guess what you're sort of saying is reattuning people's natural circadian rhythm. Were there any other aspects of the environment specifically that you feel have that impact on a person's health and well-being, besides sort of daylight and just kind of spending more time outside? Is there anything about Kenya specifically, or what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, this applies to the natural world in general. There's been shown now, I'm a bit wonky on my references here, but there are certain types of movement that the eye sees, these oscillating kind of movements, like the waves, fire, leaves moving in the wind, and things like that are shown to alter brainwave patterns.
Right. Okay.
And one of the results is you essentially de-stress. You start lowering the adrenals, like the glucocorticoids and things start coming down. No one really knows exactly why. It's a branch of science, sort of yet to be discovered. But there's something calming about being in natural environments that does that. So that you asked me a specific question, and really that kind of segues into the point that it's an entire ecosystem and environment with so many factors going on. Many of them we just don't know about. So I've got these examples that I do understand, but half of it, there's, dare I use the word faith to sort of undermine my, logical position. But there is so many examples. I can make a leap of faith that there are many, many more things going on that are beneficial that we don't understand, if that makes sense. So if I say just simply movement, we know has an effect on our allostasis. That's sort of the new word for homeostasis and hormonal responses and balance. If we know that movement does things like puts us in a better mood for various hormonal reasons, exercises your cardiovascular system, keeps it healthy, does this and this and that. But there's new things discovered all the time. So there's loads and loads and loads of things, the examples I gave, like anti-deep vein thrombosis and taking a poop. Well, God knows how many other things are going on simply by exercising, so that you wouldn't normally associate with exercise. So who knows what else is happening by being in a natural environment, which is also beneficial and or counter to, or let's just say not harmful, like perhaps being in artificial environments are. And by artificial environments, I'm generally talking about, the four-walled urban artificial light after dark, constant unnatural noise pollution of an extremely urban environment. So who knows, what else is out there? So in that sense, there's a sort of educated leap of faith. There's other stuff going on. And for practical reasons, I don't necessarily at this point, other than curiosity, need to understand it. But if my point is from getting from point A to point B, and point A to point B is to be the most optimized, healthy human being you can. I understand that those are definitely the environments that one should be living in, or at least mimicking as best as possible in our urban environments. So, the lights should be coming down after dark. The general tone of things. I mean, it doesn't have to be, completely dark. I mean, we have had fire for possibly over 1 million years, but these kinds of things that, we know that blue light stimulates the brain to release basically wake up hormones, as opposed to putting us in a rest and digest state, preparing us for a good night's sleep, which is where all the regeneration takes place. So at least those are the factors we know about that we can bring into our modern life. But the great power of being in these environments is there's probably loads of other things that we're still yet to discover. I'm
sure you're right. It makes perfect sense to me, and definitely, I think sometimes, sometimes we almost put a bit too much faith on what or not faith, but a bit too much. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but there's a phrase that's being bandied about a lot within sort of health. Health coaching, as an example, across the board, which is evidence-based. And as much as I believe that, it's really good to deliver services that are evidence-based when it comes to health, because what we've proved, through science, obviously gives us that reassurance that it works and it's real. The thing about science is that there's way more stuff we don't understand than what we do. What we're doing when we conduct scientific research is finding out what we don't know yet already, because we accept that there's a lot of it, right? That's the whole. So I still can't really put my finger on the phrase that I'm looking for, but I think, coaches, health practitioners, they're really, there's almost this habit now of disregarding anything that hasn't been scientifically proven, which is kind of ridiculous if we also accept that there's a lot of stuff out there that we've got like an understanding of, or some awareness of, but not a full understanding, that hasn't been scientifically shown. And so, if we're going to accept that, if we're going to accept that we're conducting new research all the time in order to find out what it is we don't know, and we've got to accept that there's lots of things out there that could be true that we just don't have an understanding of yet already. And if there's evidence to show that, something about a certain environment lends itself to good health, but that we just don't understand what it is, it's not to say that because it's not evidence-based, it doesn't work,
Well, there is a degree of evidence. It might be, there's a causality there. There's a causality. You might not be able to say what it is, but there's a connection. And if you're just trying to get from your average person trying to get from point A to point B, there comes a point where you don't need to necessarily know, because you know enough to be informed to move forwards on. I have enough information to action upon and benefit. There was, I can't remember if it was Satsyorsky or Bompa, but one of those leading scientists, sports scientists, if people are into their sports scientists, those are two of the biggest names out there. And there was one of them who said, basically all science is retroactive anyway. It's looking backwards. And in sports science, we're just trying to work out things that worked. But what really drives it forwards is often not objectivity, it's subjectivity. And it's the subjective instincts of great athletes and great coaches that develop new ways of doing things and pioneer things. And then afterwards, the sports scientists tell us why it works and make it replicable. But it's our instincts that drive us forward through just experience. And it's that human experience. So it may not always be totally evidence-based, but there's still a causality there that may not have been identified. And that's what, for me, time in nature does. There's a definite causality. And you see it all the time. There are so many evidence-based things anyway. For example, Lieberman and his team did some great experiments on shod versus unshod peoples. So, for example, he took a bunch of people in Kenya who basically didn't wear shoes until they were around 12. And he found that people that grew up unshod and didn't have their natural biomechanics interfered with. So basically walking, running, every human exercise, if you want to call it that, every movement pattern, even the basic ones that you think just come naturally, are a skill. They're a skill that you develop. And if you develop them poorly or inappropriately for how the human body was evolved to move, then eventually you will get some kind of chronic injury. Your knees knacker out, your hips knacker out, because you're not quite walking or running correctly. And one of the things that interferes with this is wearing shoes when you're too young. So if you imagine the human foot, this is the sole of the human foot now, it actually has as many nerve endings as your lips. And think about how sensitive your lips are. So the skin might be thicker, but you've got as much proprioception and feeling. Proprioception is a fancy word for feeling pressure. So it's neither, sort of pain nor touch in the classic sense, but it tells us where pressure is, and it helps us with our balance. And when you move barefoot, what you're doing is you're getting so much feedback, and especially when you transition from walking to running. Walking is a pendulous action that tends to go heel toe, depending on the surface. And when you run, you almost land sort of midfoot or, where's the camera? Midfoot or forefoot. So if these are the toes, you tend to land here and absorb a lot of that impact. Barefoot people tend not to run along on their heels because it's uncomfortable, it's painful, and you hear it, boom, 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 boom. In the modern world or dare I say the modern world, everything's the modern world, but in the industrial world where, our mothers in all their best interests for us think, we need to be in shoes, what happens is it alters that natural feedback, and our walking technique crosses over into our running technique, and we end up running all wrong. We basically end up running all wrong. And where I was getting at with this is the chronic lower limb injury rate in people that grew up unshod was found to be 0. Knees and hips don't knacker out with age and time. Whereas it's probably, who doesn't have a bum knee, in the industrial world? Which active person doesn't have a knackered knee? Now, there could be other reasons because of the demands of your sport or something like that, which are different. But how many runners don't have knackered in knees? And you tend to find the more expensive the running shoe, the thicker the pad is on the heel. And there's some great studies from Australia and things like that show that the more expensive your running shoe is, the more likely you are to have a knee injury or an ankle injury and things like that. So, these are some examples where, natural movement patterns that you see in traditional living peoples are more appropriate to the species, and there's something we can learn from. Hence the massive proliferation of barefoot shoes and stuff like that now, and zero drop, where they don't have thick heels on them and this kind of thing. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is there was that. Do you remember the Vibram barefoot shoes, the ones with the toes that look like a glove for your feet? There was a court case, and like all things in the public eye, the message that was received was all wrong. They actually got sued for making claims that their shoes can fix lower limb injuries, and it was found that a lot of people would transition to them and get lower limb injuries. Now, what was really happening was they never learned to move or walk or run barefoot. So when they transitioned, their feet weren't strong enough, their technique was inappropriate, and they got injured. Because to move barefoot, your feet actually need to be appropriately strong. So they actually got sued for making the claims, but not because the philosophy was incorrect. People tend to need coaching because you've learned all wrong. You need to learn to move properly before you can just go, okay, now I'm just going to go barefoot and I'll fix everything. Well, probably not. If you've been moving badly for to whoever knows how long, 25, 30, 40 years, you're not going to be ready for it. And your feet have been so-called supported. Well, guess what? If I walked around on crutches for my entire life, then threw them away, there's no way my legs are going to be able to handle, 100-meter sprint or something. They'll fall apart. So this is what's truly happening to people. Unfortunately, when the public reads that, they go, "Oh, these shoes are injuring people." It's not the shoes. If anything, it's the bad shoes that you're wearing your whole life that weakens your feet so much you can't even go halfway to being barefoot without getting injured. So these are the kind of things, and that's why we do a lot of barefoot running technique teaching on the courses. And I'm big into that. I think running with appropriate technique is probably the most healing physical exercise you can do, physically and mentally.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one good thing that may have come around off the back of Vibram being sued for that, as well as that, I think running shoe companies are taking a little bit more responsibility towards the message that they give out to people. And as an example, I've got my trail running shoes are by a company called Ultra, who tend to be specialists in that area. And the reason that I've got them is because they've got a 0 drop. What that means for people who are not sure is that they are cushioned. They do have a cushioned sole, but there's no difference between the height at the back of the sole than to the front. Yeah. So my foot essentially is still in the same position it would be if I wasn't wearing anything, but I just have that layer of cushioning there. The shoes feature a really nice wide toe box, so that and the idea behind that is that your feet have more room, your toes have more room to spread out. When your toes can spread out, tying in with what you're talking about with the work that Professor Daniel Lieberman did when they went around the world and were filming unshod people, was that one thing they noticed was that they were actually using the toes for balance. They were spreading the toes out. And so that's something that we've become aware of, is that when the toes are confined into a narrow toe box, they start to lose some of their ability to plant your feet well. And that's not such a big issue if you're running on road, manufactured flat surface, but when you're running on an undulating surface, when you're trail running, then obviously that makes a big difference to your foot placement and your ankle stability, because it starts from the bottom up. So they've got a nice wide toe box, they've got 0 drop, and they've got all these other features that are basically designed so that you can run in them, you can get the benefits of the cushioning, but it doesn't affect, or it's not supposed to negatively affect your gait or anything else to do with your running. But even they recommend that you spend some of your training time training barefoot. They have that as part of their message. So, it is a bit unfortunate for Vibram that they were made an example of. I feel particularly sorry for them, because I think that they put such a lot of work into spreading what I think is overall a very positive message. Yeah. And
it's a great product as well. So a glove for your feet as opposed to a confining shoe. I mean, they're actually brilliant. They're brilliant.
And it seems really ironic to me that a company can get sued for providing something that mimics the natural shape of a foot.
Like, I mean, it would be impossible. It'd be impossible to sue every single other shoe company in the world for weakening your feet by putting heels on your shoes. At the end of the day, a heel on the shoe was designed for riding horses, and it became a symbol of the gentry, and everybody wanted to copy it and look posh. That's really how it came about. There's no practicality, and then because it became such a the done thing, there's all kinds of what I think is just basically sort of nonsense. And you even get a lot of podiatrists that will say like, you want this much of a heel, it will help your posture. No, it doesn't. It absolutely does not. Going against the nature of the human form has never, ever, ever fixed anything. I mean, if it's so accepted. I mean, if you were to skew someone to the left or the right, being skewed in any direction has never been a benefit. It would be obvious to you, and yet somehow pitching yourself forwards by a quarter or a half an inch is somehow considered healthy. It's like, at what point would you ever skew yourself in any direction chronically all the time, every day, and consider it to be good for your physiology. It just
And that's a classic example of treating the symptoms rather than the cause, isn't it? And that's something that people are becoming a little bit more aware of within the sort of health practitioner realm. That, you know, unfortunately, a lot of physicians are really fulfilling the role of curing symptoms rather than causes. So anyway, we could dive down that topic for hours in itself, but I want to just bring it back to your time in Kenya and some of the sort of takeaways that you got from there. So obviously you've spent this time developing or applying the theory that you've learned of the evolutionary fitness model, some of the work that Lieberman's done, and taking all that stuff away, putting people through that kind of fitness regime, developing those practices for yourself, and then you kind of leave that part behind to go and do the more land management side of things, bamboo farming and the wardening and all that stuff. So how did your own personal kind of health and fitness evolve when you went from one role to the other? How, what kind of lessons did you take away from that with you, and what did that end up kind of looking like when you were moving into that next role?
I think moving into that next role really is where the theory became applied. It became real. One thing I'll always remember, sounds a bit egotistical, but working in wildlife, and then I would come back and do the fitness retreats like season to season, jump from one to the other. One of the sort of newer employees of the company, when I came back one day, and I was on the tree doing pull-ups, and her husband was a bush guy as well, and she was like, "Well, everyone talks about it, but you actually do it, don't you? You're the real deal. You actually live it." And I realized, I was like, "God, that is what I've become. It is what I've become. Like I'm walking the walk." And so taking that theory to the field was very much an unconscious transition, because it was things I've now been teaching, things I've now been doing, things I've now been living in that controlled environment where you're taking people to the beach, you're taking people to the forest. It's still a kind of controlled environment. It's not live. It's not. It's like being in the army and being on exercise and then going to war. In a less dramatic sense. It's real. Now you're actually in the bush. Now there's actual interaction with other large and dangerous species. There's people that are just living like this. Now it's just life. It's not coming out of the industrial world and simulating it in a controlled environment, in a natural environment, in a controlled way. Like, you're actually really remote. You're out there, and sometimes you're slaughtering goats and fishing for catfish and growing machicha, and that's how you're actually living now. And it was kind of like an unconscious transition into the whole thing. There was a period where, even though you're out in the bush, a lot of my patrolling was done in a Land Rover. So even though I'm right out in the bush, and there are certain periods where you're actually eating less natural food, because some of it is all preserved stuff and dry maize meal and dry rice and stuff that you're having to take out with you. That there was a period, when it was less exercise and less natural whole foods, until I learned how to use my resources and almost pretty much completely transitioned. I'd take almost nothing out with me.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, I would still be eating farmed foods, but they'd be sort of locally grown. Like I basically either learned how to grow them. There were things that were being grown like machicha and sukuma, which are basically greens, edible greens that are popular in Kenya. I would grow those myself, or just get them locally from local communities that were living out there in remote places. That's just how they lived. Local sheep, local goats, sometimes catch catfish from the river, that kind of thing. Onions locally grown, tomatoes locally grown. So nothing, out the blue, because there are certain roots and things that I would eat. Like Benson taught me to get. There's one of the local indigenous people, which I was doing community outreach. But yeah, there was a period where I was patrolling by Land Rover and eating preserved food, like I said, dried noodles and stuff like that, and until I sort of adapted and learned to use local resources, even like local milk from the cattle. I know if people are thinking about being really, I guess, hunter-gatherer, that's a pastoralist food, which is 10,000 years later, or sorry, only from 10,000 years ago that we've been eating it. I've never had any problem with milk. I think I'm probably one of those slightly adapted people that has the persistent lactase production that goes on into adulthood, which incidentally has occurred in two different populations, one in Africa and one in Europe. But yeah, I basically learned to use all those local resources. So the diet got healthier after a while. In terms of the exercise, I would have to simulate the exercise in the camp. And at that period, everything was done by vehicle. The biggest adaptation came when I basically started to trust more in training I was receiving from the local indigenous community, which were the Wata. So the long story cut short on how I met them is essentially, when you've got a skeleton crew and you're looking after wildlife and you're defending against poaching and things like that, you're never, ever, ever going to be on the spot at the right time when an incident happens. And I guess it's the same in everything. Any kind of, I don't know, sort of law enforcement or something like that. You're best off with local informants. You're best off being informed. So what I did is I reached out to a local community, because I used to keep intelligence folders on all the poaching incidents that happened. And there was a certain operandus modi where if an elephant was killed by poison arrow and the suspect was found, they tended to belong to a particular community. I became interested in the community. The community had always hunted big game. They call themselves the Wata, and they do so by traditional means. And they're actually, very traditional in their ways, even now, even though there's a blanket hunting ban, etc., across Kenya, and there's very few hunter-gatherer communities left in the country and the world. So I started to patrol by foot as I started bringing some of those guys on board. I paid them out of my own pocket to basically teach me animal tracking and animal behavior. Then I went down to South Africa, did a trails guide course, already had fairly decent knowledge, but those guys are so advanced because they've grown up like that. It's almost hard for them to come down to a lower level and teach you in a more sort of ABC basic way. They've learned from observing. So I'll give you an example of their teaching style would be, I'd see a track and they'd say, oh, this is a female leopard. And I'd recognize it as a leopard, and I'd say, how do you know it's female? And they said, well, because the female of that track looks like that. I was like, great, thanks for the diagnostic points. It's not like, the male's the pad on, on the, depending on where below the thumb sticks out a bit further,
exactly.
There'd be no diagnostic, it's like, it looks like that. Okay, cheers, thanks.
Just remember it.
Yeah. And then try and compare that with the other one that looks pretty much exactly the same. So, going down to South Africa and being taught in the way that I'm used to being taught things, in that sort of diagnostic way, a canid track, you can, always make out what appears to be an X in it, a this and a that, just on that tracking front, understanding, being taught in that A to B to C type way of animal behavior, that gave me that foundational grounding to then come back to Kenya, spend time with the Wata, and really accelerate my learning. Then I was ready to receive the information that they could give me, because I already had some context, some wherewithal. And then, at least for me, I felt like my abilities really went to a next level, really, really took off, to the point where I'm not too humble to say when I'm with the elders and some of the sort of younger contemporaries around my age or younger, I feel my bush abilities in animal behavior and tracking are at least, and sometimes, because they're less interested in it or whatever, better than some of my contemporaries. I feel very much there's like a peerage there, because there are people that are in transition, so these skills become less relevant to them. But I really put time and concentrated effort into it, and that's how I managed to get there.
And
so
you've analysed it to another level than they probably ever have, which is probably the reason why they would give you an answer like the one you said. That's the difference between somebody who's really processed it. They've just got used to seeing how it looks, following it, and seeing what's at the other end, as opposed to someone who's gone, okay, so what were the differences? Why does it look different? Oh, okay, those are the distinguishing marks, and this is how I'm going to reteach it to somebody in that tradition.
Person. Also, for a lot of the youth now, there's a blanket hunting ban. There's all kinds of other restrictions on how they can live. It's just less relevant. In fact, the truth is the only people those skills were truly relevant to were those who decided at a certain age that they were going to take up a career as poachers, big game ivory poachers, or animal skins and things like that. And that is just how they were going to live. So it became less relevant. The guys that were really good in my sort of age peer group, were all poachers. They were, which is essentially, that's a criminal. So it's been their way of life for tens of thousands of years, but nowadays it's outside the law. So these were the guys, and funny enough, these are the guys because of our mutual interest in animal behavior for different reasons, even though I'm trying to bring them over and to the side of conservation. But these became the people I sort of had the most in common with, because we had the same interest in the natural world that came from perhaps different motivations, but it was still there. So these became my closer friends. So
in another life, you could have been a poacher,
or a hunter gatherer. But because of that mutual interest, these were the guys I was more sort of connected with, of the community. So moving on, when I developed that ability to be very, very comfortable on foot in the bush, I would essentially abandon the Land Rover or drive to a certain point of the conservancy and then do foot patrol. And man, it was so much more efficacious as well, even for the job, because you're not limited to the road. Now, the roads that have been cut through. Now I'm walking through all the parts that we don't normally go. Not only would I realize that, throughout the night there was a greater, not I'm out at night, but I'm now seeing the tracks, that there's a greater abundance of wildlife there than we ever dreamed. I'm also seeing so much human sign in the most bizarre of places. I'm seeing where people have been. I'm finding illegal, like trespassing cattle grazers and goat grazers that have been trying to sort of hide out and, munch all the green bite in a particular area, leave it barren and move on, and screw up the ecosystem in that sense. I'm finding all kinds of weird and wonderful things. It could be right out in the middle of nowhere that's not even connected to, the nearest road you think is so far, is, at least 10 or 15 kilometers away, and this isn't en route to anywhere. And you find like a motorbike track or something like that. And you just, and then you have to start wondering, like, where the hell have people been going and what are they doing? What's the interest here? Is this someone restocking somebody that's come through with their herds? Is this a poacher? Is this some sort of shortcut that these guys know the area so well and they're like, astrally navigating, or or even if it's during the day by the sun and they're heading towards a certain, physical feature, and then they'll rejoin the road there. Like, what is going on? And then eventually you start to do that. So it actually made me better at the job as well. In terms of wellness and health and things like that, well, there's one. When you feel good and efficacious at things, you feel good about yourself. So that was something that came out. That was a benefit to that environment and that learning and the skills I was learning from the water. But also, I was out and about. I was on foot more, like a human being should be. I wasn't cramped up in this artificial seated position. Seating posture is, one of the banes of human life. Really, really screws up everything from, your joints and what's called ligamentous creep, which is where if you're in a position for more than about 20 minutes, your nervous system starts to accept it as nominal, and your ligaments, etc., will sit in that position rather than try and tone you back into appropriate posture. And appropriate posture is what prevents injury, chronic injury. So now I'm out on foot a bit more, and I'm not getting pseudo-sciatica from being, sat in the seated position in the Land Rover, which is probably one of the most unergonomic cars ever built anyway. Now, so yeah, I'm getting the benefits of activity. My mind's totally stimulated. I'm learning new things all day. I'm getting up and down with the sun. When there is action, when there are illegal grazers running, I'm now being stressed in an appropriate fashion. The adrenals and the cortisol is going to kick in an appropriate way. I'm now chasing guys through the bush and jumping over thorns and bushes and watching out for, I don't want to be, seen running after something by a lion and trigger its prey instinct or its prey drive or what have you. It's got more on more.
Oh, may have just dropped the connection there slightly, guys.
In every sense, as when I'm out there, I've got a place in a community. I don't know if you can still hear me. I just saw the.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, so I've got I've got a place in a community. I've got a purpose. I've got an identity. So all my sort of psychosocial things are filled up. I'm physically stimulated. I'm going to bed well. I'm eating locally. I just felt great. And then when I felt like it, every now and again, I'd maintain fitness because it's a habit for me. You sort of ask me about fitness, and I'd find a spot where we do pull-ups, or I'd get Kahindi, one of my friends, and I'd go down to all these places got like a dirt landing strip. He'd look out for buffalo and lions. Again, I don't want to trigger the prey drive. And I'd hit sets of sprints and stuff like that. Every third day or something. So
I don't think there's that many people out there that can say that during one of their push-pull days, one of the tasks at hand was to keep an eye out for lion and buffalo.
yeah, totally. So when I came out of the Land Rover and got on foot and started, basically what I would call being a human being, doing what a human being was programmed to do in at the same time a modern capacity, I felt pretty wonderful. I have to say, I felt fantastic.
Do you know, I can feel it in the way you're saying it as well. When you're recapping it's coming out to me. I obviously know you better than the average viewer out there probably.
Yeah.
But like it's quite evident to me. I can feel the sort of vibrance of your tone, like, and as you're sort of recapping it and stuff. So it's quite clear that you're having a pretty good time out there. And that's something that I wanted to ask you actually was, so funnily enough, it's interesting that we've mentioned Daniel Lieberman a couple of times. For anyone who doesn't know, he's a Harvard professor. If they want to look him up, he's got a couple of books. He's just got a new book coming out actually, which I didn't realize until I listened to an interview with him yesterday. But one of the things that he was mentioning, going back to the stuff we were talking about with regards to barefoot, he went out as part of that study. He went out to do some research on the Tarahumara Indian tribe, who were renowned for running miles and miles as part of their sort of traditional way of life, wearing nothing but either nothing or a pair of sandals. And anyway, he found various different things out of that. But at one point, he was trying to translate through his interpreter a question which was something like, how do they train? What kind of exercise do they do to improve their running? And the interpreter was having real difficulty translating this question. And it turned out that the reason was that there was no word in their vernacular that translated as training or exercise. They just did it. It was just what they did. And so one of my questions for you was going to be, once you got out there, how much, because really, just to add as well, exercise, what we think of as exercise is our substitute for physical activity that we would anyway be doing quite more often than not, or a version of, right? So, and hence why the Tarahumara Indian tribes don't have a word for exercise. They don't need to be doing exercise. They're just doing lots of physical activity, right? So we've created exercise as a substitute for the absence of physical activity.
Yeah, movement is a default state apart from in post-industrialized world. Like movement is default. So we had to invent something called exercise.
That's it. So I wanted to ask you, how much of your exercise just became your sort of day-to-day activity, and how often were you actually kind of doing specific exercise? Did the ratio between the two change, or were you still, because you obviously have identified with doing specific fitness from your athletic background and just as a Westerner anyway, how did that evolve?
It got less, I think I sort of alluded to this, as I got out the vehicle. Planned exercise. I have been who I am for a long time before doing that role. So there was a habit of still exercising. Sometimes just, I think I can sort of understand how this is just a thought that's come into my mind now. But you see in traditional cultures, sometimes there are a lot of physical games. They're what are they called? I'm probably saying this wrong, but like there's various tribes in Amazonia. I think it's Yamanono or something like that. But these types of Indians that wrestle. The Maasai, they have those sort of vertical jumping competitions. It's sort of part of a dance, but it's part of a competition. Where they try and out jump each other. There's all kinds of physical games in various traditional cultures. I would bring these sandbags with handles out. They're basically like power bags that I had built, so I could use them in the bush for training. And we'd have barrels and things like that at camp, and I'd set the barrels out and make a little course and jump over them. And then the one game scout that we had, and maybe like one of the camp assistants or the tractor driver would sometimes sort of join in. But in many ways, it wasn't like they were being intense. They just kind of wanted to get in on what I was doing for the social. And it's almost like a game. It almost becomes like a sort of traditional game. And then we, see who throw the sandbag the furthest and that kind of stuff. So it became quite often less like, I'm going to do this amount of circuits in this amount of time. And then, there was two Kahindi, and Oliver, would join in, and it became a game. And this is only literally, this is a brainwave I'm having now. I'm like, wow, this is what people have always done. They've played these kind of physical games. It's physical games and story time are sort of a big thing in human culture. So there'll always be like story time around the fire for dinner as well. But in terms of how much of my training was planned, it did become more ad hoc, or there'd be things where, my mind, I guess, still somewhat being rooted in contemporary health and fitness industry thinking, would be like, my shoulders are atrophying, like now I'm going to do more. I've got to, do some overhead presses with my sandbag, or, so on and so forth, that kind of thing. But yeah, most of it, it's just kind of kept for practical purposes, because I didn't want to lose gains that I built through contemporary fitness training. I still wanted to be able to throw heavy things as far. I still wanted to be able to sprint as fast. I still wanted to be able to, so on and so forth, because these are just things I like to be able to do in life. So there was like a sort of an urge or an urgency to try and maintain these things. But other
It's
than
bound
that,
to be, especially for specific athletic function that you're not experiencing. Like you said, it's interesting what you're saying about the French guy earlier who sort of outlined the 11, I think it was, sort of
well, his
characteristics.
original ones were 7, and that's, if anyone wants to look him up, including yourself, his name is George Herbert, or phonetically in English, George Herbert. And if you were to Google George Herbert method naturel or George Herbert fitness, then that's George with an S on the end. That's what you're gonna get.
Yeah, I'll try and include a link to him on the edited version of this when I broadcast it later. So yeah, I was going to say, so he's kind of saying in his methodology that you're going to experience kind of every part of your athletic function through that kind of, what he translated into a training model, but through natural living anyway, so it's probably a little bit of your paranoia about losing your games or whatever based on your Western experience.
Well, but there's a paranoia there, but there's also there was a practical reason in that. One, yes, I've spent a lot of time being a combat athlete, but really there was something at the back of my mind that sometimes I might actually have to fight someone. Part of the role was we used to get a lot of illegal cattle incursions, and one of the ways of combating this would be we had the right to confiscate all those cattle and bring them to a crash, and from there, it's all, Kenya. People, sort of think of the Dark Continent and think of it being this lawless place. It's a very regimented, well-run, country for all intents and purposes. So if I confiscate these cattle, even though I've got the right, it's now on me. I have an obligation to look after them. So we take all the cattle in, take them to the crash, count them, check that none of them were injured, etc., and they're all healthy. But because that is a process, what would often happen is the adults would run away. The illegal grazers run away, leave children behind because they were minors and they were under an age where they could be, say, arrested for this trespass. But every now and again, they'd be like, "Oh crap! We need our cows back. I'm going to get in trouble from the owner. Who knows? What's going on with them? These owners are encouraging them to just trespass on places. They might even be sort of low-level organized criminals in the fact that they've got the money to have all those cows, that kind of thing. So sometimes they would come back, and of course poachers themselves could potentially be violent. So in my mind, for my fitness, I was always trying to maintain my abilities, basically in case I got in a fight. And that has happened. That did happen from time to time. I mean, there was one guy from the spot that we took the cattle. It was 12 kilometers to get to the crash. We were 2 kilometers away, and I know this because I've got like a sort of wrist-mounted GPS. So the guy must have run 10k with a spear to come and argue with me to get the cows back. He got more and more irate. This is just sort of one occasion, where essentially I ended up being attacked by a guy with a spear and had to fill him in. Well, not fill him in, but restrain him.
Fill him in.
Take him, and then take him to the police station. So there was a very real possibility because of the role that I may end up in a physical confrontation. So I wanted to maintain my sort of combat sports appropriate fitness for that.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, because my question really was going to be, even though technically speaking, within that kind of natural living, sort of more natural living lifestyle, you would be taking care of all components of fitness on some level, there must have been some elements of fitness that you felt were lacking from what you needed. And not, as you've just said there, your kind of sports specific, combat specific fitness was something that clearly wasn't being taken care of by itself, just through, fulfilling your role for work or whatever else you were doing there. So yeah, that nicely answered that one anyway. So I think probably it's going to have to be the last question, although I'd love to do probably a second part on this because there's still loads of stuff that I'd like to ask. And as always, I've been over ambitious on how many questions we're going to get through in one episode. But one thing I really wanted to ask was, you've already touched on the Wata and how they were master hunters, master trackers, and anyone who knows anything about hunting knows that hunting of any kind, well, of the kind that they're doing especially, but more traditional methods particularly, requires a massive amount of focus, a massive amount of attention, a massive amount of discipline, staying quiet, moving slowly, these kinds of things. And these are all aspects of health that many people have real problems with nowadays. Many of the clients that come to me, especially sort of executive professionals, that kind of person, even if their primary goals are just to get in better shape, like these are still things that quite often come up as secondary goals that they'd like to work on to be more productive at work and stuff like that. So my very broad, as always, question is, what kind of lessons could somebody from the developed world who wanted to work on things like focus and attention and productivity take away, do you think, from some of the practices that they have out there when they're looking at improving or practicing their hunter tracker skills? Is there anything that comes to mind?
There's something that really comes to mind, and I think it's something you hear sort of banded around in modern psychology, but it's something, especially during the process of going out and hunting and tracking big and potentially dangerous game, and it is having that kind of acceptance of what things you can control and things you can't, and just accepting and letting go of the things you can't control. So they can't control the weather. They can't control if the bull elephant they were after, smells a female in heat and then just is out of there, or if the wind changes direction, or they can adapt to it and they can move, but it's not going to happen as quickly as they wanted. They've got to do an extra thing. They've got to do an extra that. And do you know what? Took too long, and now it's dark. So I think there's an amazing patience of tomorrow's another day, and make a plan. Make a plan for now. Make the best of now, and move forwards. There's certain things that are, after all, beyond your sphere of influence, and to be okay with it. And even in their superstitions, when they're out hunting, there's a bird, type of woodpecker, and in their superstitions, as they're going out to hunt, if it calls from the front or the left or the right or behind, will basically dictate how the hunt's going to go. So if you wanted a short hunt and you hear it, calling from the right, and it means, it means we're going to get it, but it's going to be an effort. All right, we might as well mentally prepare for this to be an effort. And or if it calls from behind, pack up. We're not doing a long hunt today. We're not going to get anything big. Let's see if we can get a warthog, and that kind of thing. We're not getting an elephant, or we're not getting a buffalo or a giraffe or a rhino today. That's out of the question. And, we'll do something else, or maybe just go home and wait till tomorrow. So even though I know that those are superstitions and sound like more sort of self-fulfilling prophecies, but that could equally be a change of wind, a change of weather, the coming of a sudden deluge storm, something like that. Is you see it in those elders. They're all very, very okay with things that happen, and it translates into other things. I've been with them when vehicles are broken down and stuff like that, and they're suddenly like, all right, guess we're walking for 4 hours, and they just get on with it, rather than, shit, could have been there in 30 minutes, now we're walking, or, it's, there's a great kind of acceptance of things that are in your control and not in your control. So I'd say that was a massive translatable skill that especially those elders that really live that full fat hunter-gatherer existence really, really exhibit.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I really didn't know what you were going to potentially say, and I think that's a super interesting point. I mean, I think for me as well, sort of controlling the controllables and then sort of being accepting of everything else. It's kind of two parts. You know, it's one part, yeah, that acceptance helps you just deal with things. You know, just getting over things, not allowing your mindset to be disturbed by the negative aspects of whatever has happened. You know, making that conscious choice. Yeah, that happened, and my instinct is to feel kind of shitty about it, but I'm making the choice to just get on with it. And then the other part of it is actually sort of efficiency of energy output, you know, because as long as you're worrying about those uncontrollables, you're just sort of wasting energy on that. When actually, you know, talking again about sort of focus, must be to focus for so many hours that are required to execute a hunt. You know, you can't be expending energy on stuff that you don't need to, presumably. So it's kind of like an efficiency thing as well. It's like, I'm not going to worry about this because I just need to focus my energy on the thing that's actually going to get me the goal.
That's your life experience coming out. I reckon that's your experience in the Marines coming out, because that is what's happening. That is what's happening. Like they at the end of the day, that overarching goal is always the overarching goal, and everything else is by the by. You know, it might be long, it might be short, but at the end of the day, it's just about it's about hunting and eating when they're doing that, and that translates into a lot of other aspects of their lives.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're probably right. Actually, that's quite an astute observation from you. Thinking back, you made me sort of think back to recruit training and stuff. And I remember like a turning point in training for me was when I realized that I could worry about all the stuff that was going to go wrong and all the beastings that we were going to get and all the, you know, and the next parade, the next inspection, the next exercise that you're going to do. I could worry about all of that stuff and it was all just going to still happen anyway. And the only thing I really needed to worry about was don't give up. Don't volunteer your way out. Only leave if someone tells you to or if you get injured, and just be here at the end. And as soon as that kind of flipped that way of thinking and, you know, stopped worrying about the next thrashing that was going to happen anyway, the next inspection that you're probably going to fail anyway, you know, the next bullshit punishment that you're going to get for whatever it might be. It's the whole thing just became much easier because I could just focus on that end goal. And so I think you're probably right there. That's it's a good observation, and very translatable for sure, as you say. So I've already let this one go on for quite a bit longer than usual because there's so many points that I would still love to go over. But I think we'll finish this one here. Is there anything else that you feel worth mentioning that you had in mind to cover before I wrap up?
I don't think I can say them quickly.
No, that's right. I would love to just do like another section on this, specifically talking about the Wata people, because I think their story is super interesting, and I'd really like to go a little bit deeper into the differences between the way they live, how they see health and performance, because they are high performance people in their skill set, in their particular regard, and so I'd really like to talk a little bit more about that, but at another time for sure. Guys who are watching or listening, if you've got anything that you'd like us to cover relevant to this potentially in upcoming videos, feel free to post it in the comments, even send me a direct message. I think this is a super interesting topic, and definitely want to do a little bit more on it, so any input from the audience can certainly go into that as well. One final thing, if you're out there you're looking to take the leap to high performance, improving your health, enhancing your body and mind, especially at this time during the current global situation, there are some places available on our exclusive coaching program, subject to application. I'll include a link in the description where you can put your application in for that. If you want to get on the phone with me and talk about your particular fitness and performance goals, happy to do that. at any time and see if we're the right fit to work with each other on those. Apart from that, everyone have a terrific rest of the day, evening, whichever time zone you're in, and we will catch you very soon. Thanks again for joining, Gaz. Oh, frozen. Thanks very much, guys. Take care.